Great, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here today, and I'm really excited to share some of the information I've gathered about diversity, equity, inclusion. So first, I want to highlight that we know that underrepresented groups have been sort of systematically and historically excluded from STEM fields, and that's the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. But we knew that it's not because they don't have desire or ability. We also know that there's disparity in pay, and we'll talk about some of that. And we also know that self-doubt, or what we call imposter syndrome, also influences the probability that people will both enter and stay within STEM fields. And lastly, it's been demonstrated that there's what we call a leaky pipeline in academia, and we'll talk about that analogy in just a moment. One thing we know is that we will not fix these issues unless these underrepresented groups stand up for equal opportunity. But I want to highlight that it cannot stop there. Overrepresented groups must recognize these are true issues and actively work to support and promote underrepresented groups. So we hear a lot about DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I thought it might be worthwhile just to take a moment and actually define these terms. So diversity is the representation of all of our varied identities and differences, collectively and as individuals. Whereas equity is ensuring the fair treatment, equality of opportunity, and fairness and access to information and resources for all. While inclusion builds a culture of belonging by actively inviting the contribution and participation of all people. And I want to highlight that just because you fix one does not mean that you fix them all. So oftentimes institutions or departments will have diversity matrices they're trying to reach. Just because you reach that, it's not where it ends. We have to actively create an atmosphere that values these diverse perspectives and values all perspectives equally. So essentially what we should be doing is inviting people to join our spaces as they are, and not conforming to some preconceived idea as to who should be at the table. We also know that things like unconscious or implicit bias can really contribute to the exclusion of people across different communities, including STEM. And these implicit biases refer to our attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Implicit biases are activated involuntarily, unconsciously, and without one's awareness or intentional control. And we know that they're very robust and pervasive. We also know that everyone is susceptible to them, even people we believe should be impartial, such as judges or scientists. And it's even been documented in children. If you think you're immune, I'd actually encourage you to take one of these online tests. You'd be surprised what you find. And it's not just that I would encourage you to take them. I think every single person should be identifying where their implicit biases are, knowing that everyone has one or more, because we want to use that to limit our ability to let those implicit biases come through, especially when we're making decisions. And I really love this quote by Carolyn Finney that she shared during the SOCNAS conference this last fall. She said that bias is not the same as prejudice, and it's not the same as racism, but they are close cousins. And so I want people to think about the fact that they can have huge implications on sort of how we both behave but respond in certain situations, and that we really have to limit the impact that they have. So let's go back to this leaky pipeline analogy. So it's a very nice analogy in the sense that it's easy to understand, but it has its limitations, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But the idea is that let's imagine you're sort of thinking about STEM fields, like we're looking at who's actually entering the STEM field. And for ease, we'll talk about men versus women, recognizing that we're not acknowledging our non-binary colleagues, nor all the other axes of diversity that drop out. But it's easy to understand because we know that women are 50% of the demographic in the United States. So if we sort of said, okay, well, we should see equal representation of men and women across STEM. And that's what we see in this graph at the sort of university graduate level. But at each sort of conjuncture, sort of point along the pipeline where we're moving into a new academic rank, we're losing considerably a large proportion of women. So once we get to the sort of highest levels of full professor, we have very few women still participating in STEM. Now, I mentioned that this metaphor is very helpful to illustrate sort of the fact that we're losing people. But the reason I don't like this metaphor is because a leak in a pipe actually suggests that it's some sort of passive method by which we're losing these individuals. I like to think of it much more as like a strainer where we're actually actively selecting who should stay in and who should leave. So why should we focus about this question about women in science? Well, as I already mentioned, since we know that the women make almost 50% of the demographics of our country, we know that we have easy sort of metrics to try to hit. I'd also argue that this is an everyone issue and not an issue just for women. And that's because we know that we all have these unconscious or implicit biases, and that both men and women can be biased against women. We also know that women are more likely to be subjected to inappropriate and sexual comments and advances. And since women are lost at every level during that leaky pipeline, we actually need to do a lot of work to both encourage but also retain them. I also think that the women in science conversation is what I call a gateway conversation, meaning that we can have these conversations about equity of women in STEM because everybody recognizes that women are about 50% of the population. Hopefully everyone knows a woman that they love or like at least. And so they would probably want them to have equal opportunity. Now, in addition to the fact that I considered a gateway conversation to having more meaningful conversations around other axes diversity, it's also where we have the most data. So if we look here at all jobs across the United States, we can see that women and men hold about equal number of positions across all jobs. But if we now focus in on STEM jobs, what we see suddenly is that women are disproportionately not involved in STEM jobs, suggesting that there's something that's sort of keeping them from being involved in this fields. In addition, if we look at STEM jobs versus non-STEM jobs, of course, across the board, we see that if you're in a STEM job, you're likely to make a higher wage or income. But we also see a disparity that women on average are only making 84 cents on the dollar for their male colleagues. Now, if we look across several fields within STEM, first what we're looking at here are the non-tenured faculty. We can see that even in the group of programs, the biological, agriculture, and environmental life sciences, we only have about 41% represented of women in these non-tenured faculty. And it's even more grim if we look at the tenured faculty. Across the board, we're doing quite terribly at the inclusion of women in these tenured positions. And some fields are actually doing really terribly. So this is an interesting study. It was actually published by a bunch of the program officers from the National Science Foundation. And what they were trying to understand is if there was some inequity in who was receiving grants, both who was applying, but also who was receiving funding. But before they could do that, the first thing they needed to do was just establish sort of the baseline of who's present each of the subfields that they, or fields that they grant funding to. And so what you're looking at is the number of men and women professors at different career stages across 6 different fields. And the blue circles are for men and the red triangles are for women. And what you'll see across the board, we see a lot of inequity in sort of who's participating in these fields. But I think what's more alarming for me is that for many fields, even at the assistant level, we have very few women who are involved in these careers, suggesting that we really are going to have to do some active work to sort of rectify these numbers. So we know that there's an impressive body of literature that shows that most people associate math and science fields with being male and humanities and arts fields with being female. We know that when women are in male jobs, they're often viewed as less competent than their male peers. When they are clearly competent, they're often considered less likable. That people are less likely to ascribe credit to a woman than a man for identical accomplishments. And on average, people are less likely to hire a woman than a man with identical qualifications. So I would argue that this is not just a women's only issue, that we definitely need men there to help rectify this situation, but we also need to sort of expand our conversation to talk about other historically marginalized groups or excluded groups. We also have less data and publicity for this, but let's walk through what the scientific literature does say. So if we look at who's employed in STEM fields, what we can see right away is that white men are disproportionately employed across STEM fields. Now, you also might say, well, that's from 2006. We've actually, this conversation has been happening for a while, but really in the last 10 years, we've really grown the way that we think about it. So let's fast forward almost 10 years later and see what's changed. What we see is that white men now have lost 6% of the employment in STEM fields, where we actually have no change for white women and very incremental changes for a subset of the historically excluded groups. And some we've actually seen no gain at all. So even in that 10 years, we're actually making almost no headway. So this is a study that looked at the success rate of first generation students and often low income students in college. And so each of the bars represents and the individuals that fit into one of 4 socioeconomic categories, with the sort of pale purple meaning they needed full financial aid, all the way through the light blue, which means that they needed no financial aid at all. And then the first 2 sets of bar graphs are for first generation math and science students, as well as humanities and social sciences students. And of course, what we can see is that your income status does affect your ability to be successful in your undergraduate career. But what's more alarming to me about this graph is that this seems to hold true in the second set of bars, even for second generation students. And that's not something we had been being mindful of or thoughtful about. We sort of imagine that once you sort of had an opportunity to go to college, that knowledge and experience would carry through and help you be successful in the future. But what we're seeing is there's a lag. Now, if we look at those who are employed in STEM fields with disabilities, what we can see is that, of course, having a disability means you're less likely to be employed in general, but even in the STEM fields. And so we're seeing an exclusion of people just based on being able-bodied or not. And if we look at sort of underrepresented people in the full-time professor fields across STEM, the data is really alarming to me. So what we see is regardless of whether we're looking at all institutions or just R1 institutions, we've seen very little change through time over this 20-year period. And in fact, at the highest, what we have is about 6% representation of these people in STEM fields. And we know that African Americans are severely underrepresented in STEM. I wanted to highlight, so in one of my fields, so I'm an entomologist and evolutionary biologist. In my field of evolutionary biology, Joseph Graves in 1988 was the first African American or Black person to earn a PhD in evolutionary biology. So even within our subfields, despite the fact that biology on whole is doing quite well with diversity, we still have particular places where we really need to be mindful of what's happening. And if we look at the study on the right, what they essentially did is they looked at who was applying to US medical schools. And they've actually controlled for their representation in the general population of the United States. And what we see is that Asian Americans and white Americans are overrepresented in who's applying, and that we see that Blacks and Hispanics are underrepresented. Now, I want to point out that this is just who's applying. So there's already some sort of preconceived idea that they don't belong in the medical field before they even apply, let alone who actually makes it through. We also know that we're losing LGBTQ and likely IA+ undergraduates in STEM. So what this study did is they actually followed individuals who identified as LGBTQ and then looked at whether they were likely to stay enrolled in STEM fields when they first declared that as their major. And what we found is that for men who identified as LGBTQ, we had really low retention. And in fact, it's not that they were dropping out of university, they were just switching majors out of STEM fields, suggesting that there's something there that's preventing them from wanting to stay engaged in a field that they had initially been interested in. So stereotypes persist, and we know that they can be quite harmful, that women in male jobs are viewed as less competent than their male peers. And when they're clearly competent, they're often considered less likable. This is this idea that when men show strong traits, they're often considered leaders and women are considered bossy. That women of color reported that they had to confront negative racial stereotypes, that Black women more than any other group reported a bleak sense of isolation, which I think is really disheartening. That Latinx and Black women also reported as being mistaken for janitors or admins, and that men of color described similar experiences. And that Asians reported stereotypes, notably the forever foreign assumption, that even if they had been, in the United States for multiple generations, it was assumed that English might not be their first language. And that women and people of color are often held to higher standards of personal appearance and dress. And we also know that they're often held to higher rates of publication and grant success to be considered successful. So this is a study that was done a few years ago now, where a group of science faculty put together 2 resumes, and the resumes are identical. And one has the first name Jennifer and one has the first name John. And what they did is they sent these science resumes, they were for people who had recently completed an undergraduate degree, around to other science faculty at universities across the United States, and just stated that they were thinking of hiring this person, but their university required an outside evaluation as to, were they hireable, what was their competency level, and would they, what should you pay them? And then also, what amount of mentoring or professional development you give them. And what they found across the board is that the male students were more likely to be hired, to be compensated at a higher rate, and were more likely to receive mentoring than the female students. But I think what was really most shocking about this study when it came out is that women and men were equally likely to rank the woman lower. And the business world has been looking at these kinds of questions for a much longer time than the academic world, because I think ultimately the bottom line is the dollar. And so ultimately they want to know how to make money. And so this study was implemented where they took 4 resumes and just changed the names with Greg and Emily and Lakeisha and Jamal, uploaded them to a popular job board where people can contact individuals they're interested in hiring, and then looked at how many times were they viewed and how many times were they contacted for interviews. And probably not surprising, what they found is that Emily and Greg were much more likely to be employed or at least have an interest in the labor market than Lakeisha and Jamal. So one of the things I've heard throughout my career is that we just don't have enough women in the pipeline, and that if we wait long enough, eventually what we'll see is equity. And the same thing holds true for other axes of diversity. But I want to point out that if we sort of extend out from this more recent time when we were being more thoughtful about these issues, at this rate, it's going to take us 90 years to reach gender parity, suggesting that whatever metrics we've been using and measures have not been successful. So we have to actually take a new approach. So first off, why should we all work to solve these problems? We know that there's currently not enough trained candidates to fill all the STEM jobs. We know that when you have diverse teams, you have increased innovation, increased creativity and problem solving, increased teamwork. You're more likely to both attract and retain talent. And we know that these diverse workforces are important across all axes of diversity. You don't have to trust me though. So here's a couple of examples from the scientific literature. Here, what they did is they went through and assessed the names of individuals across hundreds of thousands of publications, and then asked the question, when you have gender heterogeneous working groups, so meaning that the author lists, at least from that you can identify from the first names, are likely to be male and female, that the publication would have a higher quality impact and a higher staying power within the scientific literature than when you had articles that were authored by all men teams. Unfortunately, the number of all women teams the sample size wasn't large enough to include. So I think that also says something about this. In addition, research has shown that ethnic diversity also increases scientific impact. And what I liked about this study is what they did is they put groups of diverse problem solvers together and then pitted them against these high ability problem solvers. And what they showed is that the groups of diverse problem solvers outperformed the high ability problem solvers, suggesting that when you have like-minded people trying to solve something versus diverse-minded people, you're more likely to reach the outcome that you're after when the teams are diverse. There's also a nice blog on it on the Scientific and American website if you're interested in looking at more examples of how diversity is beneficial to science. We also know that women in underrepresented groups receive fewer scholarly awards. So this is across 4 major fields in STEM. And what we're looking at is both full professors and PhD students. And what we see is that in all cases, women are receiving very few awards, with the highest being about 27 or 28%. And the reason I highlight this is because I want to encourage everyone to nominate deserving women and underrepresented scientists for awards, and not just diversity awards or teaching awards. Since one of the things that the data shows is that women and other historically excluded groups are less likely to self-nominate, and they're less likely to ask others to nominate them. I also want to highlight that everyone has to work to advance these issues, because currently what we see is that underrepresented faculty have to play a disproportionate role in advancing diversity and inclusion issues. So what are the barriers that are preventing success in STEM careers? We know that there's a lack of role models. We know there's a lack of publicity aimed at women and other underrepresented groups. We know that there's a perceived lack of job opportunities. We know that there can be a lack of encouragement or family support, and not that the families don't want them to succeed. It's that there's often little understanding of what it takes to be successful in STEM. We know that many of those individuals feel isolation and lack of support. And there can be a lack of flexibility in part-time work, especially for individuals who are shouldered with more family obligations, whether it's caring for children or for elder care, or just for being more involved in the home. We also know that STEM has a white male dominated culture. And we know that the lack of confidence or this imposter syndrome can really hold people back from feeling that they belong. We also know that there's a lack of mentors. But I want to highlight the good news is that we can actually fix all of these, and actually we can fix them quite easily. So how do we actually solve these problems? First and foremost, we need policy changes that limit the effects of our bias, and this should be happening at the department, institutional, and all sort of levels. We need to acknowledge and work to reduce our own biases. So that means first we need to identify them. So I would again encourage everyone to take the implicit bias tests. We also have to work to reduce the implicit bias of others by actively supporting others and calling out people when they're inappropriate through doing things like active bystander measures. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So how do we actually do that? Well, one thing we can do is priming. So this is a way in which you consciously prime yourself to pay attention to potential areas of bias that can essentially interfere with our decision-making process. So one way to think about that is if you're about to go into some sort of situation where you're going to be evaluating applicants, whether it's graduate student applicants or people applying for jobs in your lab, or whether you're searching for a new faculty member, knowing what your own biases are, you can then prime yourself to limit them. So for example, if you were biased against women, you might say, okay, I know some really amazing science women, and think of their names and really reprime yourself and get your brain retrained. So before you look at those evaluations, you're less likely to have that bias influence you. The data suggests that priming exercise certainly can last hours, and in some cases can last up to 3 months. We also have to reorganize structures and systems to create behavior in organizations that by creating consistency in how certain processes are carried out so that you can encourage less biased behavior. We also need new forms of accountability. So we need to use these diversity metrics to check for potential bias, to identify when and if there are breakdowns in the system. So we often hear people claiming that they're allies, but I want to point out sort of the true definition of an ally. An ally is someone from a non-marginalized group who uses their privilege to advocate for a marginalized group. What they're doing is they're transferring the benefits of their own privilege to those who lack it. You can only be an ally through action. Remember, it's a verb, not a noun in this case. So you can't be an ally because you decide you are an ally or you use the term and claim yourself as an ally. It's only through your actions. Where performative allyship is when someone from that same non-marginalized group professes support and solidarity with a marginalized group in a way that's either not helpful or actively harms that group. Performative allyship usually involves the ally receiving some kind of a reward, whether it's on social media or a virtual pat on the back for being a good person or on the right side. I really like these tips from Francesca Ramsey on sort of how to be an ally. First and foremost, you have to understand your privilege. And I want to highlight here that every single person has some access of privilege. And so it doesn't mean that you're rich. It doesn't mean you had an easy life or have never had to work hard. There's just some things in your life you'll never experience or have to think about because of who you are. You should listen and do your homework. You should speak up and not over. And you will make mistakes. And if you do, apologize. It's very important to remember it's not about your intent, it's about your impact. And I want to reiterate there, it's not about your intent, it's about your impact. And again, remembering that ally is a verb, simply saying your ally is enough. You actually have to do steps 1 through 4 over and over again. And I want to highlight here that in academia, sometimes it's just showing up. And so, if you have a colleague who's winning awards or whether they're giving workshops or town halls, just show up and be there to support them. We talk a lot about being an active bystander, but before we talk about how to be an active bystander, let's define what just a bystander is. Bystander is a person who observes a conflict or unacceptable behavior. It might be something serious or minor, one time or repeated, but the bystander knows the behavior is destructive or likely to make a bad situation worse. Where an active bystander actually takes steps to make a difference. And I want to remind you that if it's unwanted, it's harassment. Harassment is always defined from the point of view of the target. And again, the intent is not important. So how do you respond as an active bystander in situations? There's sort of two strategies. One is in the moment and one's after the fact. So in the moment, you want to name or acknowledge an event. You always want to talk from your own point of view, not the target's. You can interrupt the behavior. You can publicly support the person that was the target, or you can remove the target or harasser from the situation. So let's go through some scenarios. So let's imagine we're at a scientific conference. It's the poster session. You're standing around with a group of people, some you know well, some you don't, and someone starts to tell a joke. And you can tell already that this joke is going in a way that it's going to be offensive. So immediately you can interrupt and say, I'd like you to stop telling this joke now. I find it offensive. Or it may be after the fact you tell them this. You can also interrupt behaviors, right? Or remove a target or harasser. So a way to do it in this situation is, let's imagine we're back at that same scientific conference. You're talking to a colleague. You look over and you see somebody who's presenting their research on a poster, and someone else is leaning in and touching them a bit, and you can see that they're uncomfortable. So what you can do is walk over and say, hey, listen, to the person who's presenting their work, I was going to take a bathroom break. Do you want to join me so that we can be back together to present our work on our posters quickly? Or maybe it's that you interrupt the behavior by walking up to the harasser and saying, listen, I've been wanting to talk to you about your research. Could you step over here for a minute? I had a really important question I wanted to ask, just to break up the situation. There's also strategies for after the fact. You can report the incident. You can talk privately with the harasser, or you can talk privately with the target. Sometimes talking privately is more effective, although sometimes actually naming an offense at the time is the most effective way. If you think that this person, it might be a one-time offense, or they maybe were unaware of the fact that what they were doing was essentially harassment, talking privately to the person might actually be helpful. Or in other situations, if they're a repeat offender, that may actually not be effective at all. I'd actually encourage everyone to join a diversity in science group. You can either join one or start one if you don't have a group at your institution that you really want to join. And I encourage everyone to join a diversity in science group. I'm actually a member of many of these organizations you're seeing on the screen now, but I'm going to share a personal story. So I've been actively involved in women in science and diversity in science initiatives for quite a long time. And I have a colleague who's involved in the leadership for SOCNIS. And for those of you who don't know, SOCNIS is the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science. And it's actually now become the largest diversity conference in the world. But I knew they had been involved in this for a long time. And they were like, hey, Corrie, you should come to our conference. You'd love it. And I was like, but I don't identify as any of the things that this conference is set out to promote. And my friend looked at me and just said, well, they want allies there too, dummy. And I just felt so foolish at that moment because I had made an assumption about who they actually wanted there. And making the assumption that allies weren't welcome was really silly of me. So that day, I actually joined as a lifetime member of SOCNIS, and I go to their conference every year, and I actively promote that organization. So I just want to sort of summarize by saying that we need to support policy changes that limit, reduce, or remove bias. Each of us needs to become aware of our biases and work to overcome them. And when you have identified them, make sure you're priming yourself when you're in decision-making situations. You want to encourage and support underrepresented groups in STEM fields. You need to have mentors and role models. We know these are very important, so you should find one or serve as one. We know that we need to nominate women and other historically excluded groups for scientific awards, and not just diversity or mentoring or teaching awards for the rigorous research they're conducting. We need to ensure diversity on all admissions, hiring, and promotions committees, recognizing that we're often tasking our diverse individuals in our departments to take on way more service than most people do. So maybe we need a way of compensating that, or at least acknowledging it. And lastly, I want to encourage everyone to join and support these women in science and diversity groups, regardless of your gender, sex, identity. And lastly, remember, being an ally is an action and not an identity. And so everyone can be an ally. You just have to do the work. So with that, I'll flip it over and say now is a time that we can engage in some conversations.